Hello all and welcome to Module 4, Week 8. Today I just have a couple reminders for you. So just a reminder that Task 4 is a TED Talk, and the TED Talks can be anywhere between 50 and 45 minutes. So make sure that you go through a couple before you actually decide on one. So spend some time in the TED Talks looking them over and deciding what it is you want to provide your analysis on. Second general reminder, obviously keep working on your final paper. Our readings have slowed down and I've reduced the amount of writing that we're doing in the discussion boards to make sure that you have plenty of time to continue to work on your final paper. My last note is for all of these readings, we're talking about language, we're talking about culture, and we're talking about power. And because we're talking about all of these three, we all come from our own individual perspectives and we have our own individual experiences, which is one of the things that's so important to all four of these authors, which also means there's no right answer in the discussion board. So play around with everything that's in the discussion board and find answers that are comfortable for you. The first article that we talk about is Lippy Green, who talks about standard language ideology or the idea of hegemony. So the goal of language and the goal of education is to create a hegemony among people. So if we have one particular way of approaching language and we have one idea of what language is and we teach those two things to everybody, then it's going to be standardized. So the idea of standard written English, standardized spelling is definitely a part of this. And the goal of the standardization is to make everything equal, to make everything what seems like fair. The danger is if we don't experience other cultures and we don't experience other ideas, we can't necessarily reflect on our own learning or consider our own learning or understand how our language is so heavily tied to who we are as people and then how that's going to impact where we go in our life. So the big thing that Lippy Green points out is that language is a signal of who we are, who we cannot be, or who we are not. So if we're dealing with ideas like that, we have writers come into our classrooms all the time and they say, I'm not a good writer. They're so stuck on the idea that language has already determined who they are and who they cannot be, and a writer is one of those particular things. So then we don't need to just deal with language issues. We don't need to just deal with grammar issues. We don't need to just teach students how to organize papers, how to use supporting details, how to determine the rhetorical situation for their discipline. We need to teach them how to overcome the identity connection that they have in relation to language. And that's a really tough position, but it's a position that we're always in. And so Lippy Green offers two analytical tools. You'll play around with those in the discussion board. The second article that we read for today is Matsuda and Matsuda, who are dealing with the idea of world Englishes. So world English as a concept is really, really big right now because we have English for specific purposes. We have English for business purposes. We have students learning English from other countries because they need it to go to work. NAU is seeing a huge influx of students from China because they're coming here to learn English so that they can go to work for a business in China to improve relations between the two countries or to negotiate things between the two countries because they've studied abroad. When we consider English in the English department and what we teach, a lot of what we teach is literature, creative writing. Neither of those really fit the idea of English as a second language. And so what Matsuda and Matsuda are dealing with is when we look at English as a world English, there's not just one right way to speak English. So the English department as a whole with literature and creative writing, while very, very good departments to have within the English department, that's not the only way to teach English. That's not the only way to learn English, and that's something that we need to account for. And so world English as a concept is attempting to do that by saying don't valorize the dominant because it's reifying a specific view of English, and also don't valorize the alternative discourses because they're just as powerful. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to communicate sometimes in standard written English. So we need a combination of both. So what Matsuda and Matsuda propose is that we emphasize the rhetorical situation to writing. How do we teach students to understand the rhetorical situation when they write, when they read, and when they communicate so that they can understand all of these variations in communication? Next, for discussion 16, we discuss Guerra, who specifically lays out a lot of the history, especially the very, very complex history of the idea of literacy and literacy studies. So he starts with the idea of literacy as oral versus written and how early literacy theorists actually considered oral literacy to be less developmentally advanced as written literacy, and then all of the complication within that, especially with Heath, who brought up the idea that oral literacy and written literacy aren't necessarily on the same continuum, but are on different continuums. So a lot of that early research influenced Street, who proposes the idea of the ideological model of literacy. So in every given situation that we enter into, there is a kind of literacy that is valued in very, very specific ways. And by literacy here, we don't just mean reading and writing, but it's reading and writing as well as reading and writing practices, how those specific practices are valued, communication practices that are important in that particular situation. Both Street and G start with the idea of the ideological model of literacy and kind of move it forward to the idea of situated literacies, which we saw with the New London Group article that we read earlier in the semester. So how do we understand the correct practices in a given situation, and then what is it that we do with those specific practices? What Guerra is raising this for is the idea of transculturation. So if we have specific practices that are valued in different situations, how does education and the education model, especially at the collegiate level, recognize the situated literacies that they're teaching? We're teaching academic literacies in very, very specific ways, and we're valuing those particular literacies over others. So when we correct for commas or we correct for grammar, we're saying that there is a right kind of grammar, there's a right way of understanding grammar. And at what point do we say that this is the right way of understanding always, as opposed to this is the right way of understanding in this particular situation? So if we look at the difference between the structure of a humanities sentence and the structure of a biology sentence, even the verb choice is very different. We have a tendency to use more active verbs in the humanities than the sciences. The sciences like the more passive verbs, the have with the ing construction, because that indicates a very distanced view of the particular methodology. And so instead of the researcher doing the research was done and it was completed, which gives it more validity and more logical power for very specific reasons. So even within academia, we have differences. So Guerra's raising the idea of transculturation. How do we value other cultures and other cultural ways of knowing so that we can then address all of these different literacies that students come to our classrooms with? How do we understand and value those experiences while also understanding and valuing and teaching the situated literacies that are expected at the collegiate level? The last article that we read for today is Delpit, who talks specifically, and she's kind of drawing off of Guerra for this particular one, explicit and indirect power. So once we have situated literacies, if we don't recognize them, how much power is there? What is the culture of power? How is culture of power reified? How do specific groups stay in power? And her big point is if you're in power, you don't even understand power. It's those that are disempowered or those that are acted upon that understand the power dynamics. So if we're in a position, especially in higher education, where we are powerful, we are setting the tone, and we don't understand that, how is that devaluing and excluding large numbers of our students? And then what happens when they're excluded? So if we view writing as it's a process that has a lot to do with our identity. So I am a good writer or I am not a good writer, like we talked about with one of the first articles. So how do we value that in a way that we can help students develop a powerful voice in a very specific way? So Delpit's approach is a pedagogical mix of skills and process. So I need to some extent address situated grammar and address situated understanding. I need to address stylistic choices, but I also need to address writing as a process. There are steps that can be engaged in that can help a writer develop their overall argument and understand how to support their particular arguments in very specific ways. So she's really trying to get at how do we mix all of these so that we can understand communication across cultures better, more fully, so that teachers can discuss their particular theories in a different way, so that even teachers, who aren't your traditional white middle class males can be taken seriously for the pedagogical choices that they're making instead of having them negated simply due to their gender or their race. So Delpit's really dealing with power, even power that's enacted upon certain teachers who don't fit the mold. So overall, all of these articles are talking about how do we view writing, how do we view English, and how do we avoid reifying the right way to read, the right way to learn, the right way to write. How do we view reading and writing and learning in alternative ways that allow students' individual experiences to have meaning, to hold weight in our classrooms, while also teaching them how to communicate at the collegiate level in this particular situated literacy? How does all of that come together? So the videos that you're watching for, or you're going to analyze the website and you're going to watch a video for the discussion boards this week, just keep in mind, because these ideas are very, very complicated and there is no right answer, there's no right answer in the discussion boards. So I want you to really think about, really consider, and really play with ideas of power, of different kinds of English, of situated literacies. How do these things function? You need to consider and you need to reflect on your own position and your own experience and how that heavily influences your own pedagogy in the classroom. So how can we change that? How can we look at it differently? Or if that's not something that needs to be changed, how can we at least be aware of some of the influences on our own teaching practices? If you guys have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you in the discussion board. If you need to get a hold of me quickly or immediately, feel free to send me a tweet on Twitter.